Okay, let's start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on inequities in the global financial system, tackling the looming debt crisis in the global south, featuring Dr. Fred Olaile as our distinguished speaker. My name is Roy Culpepper. I chair the Group of 78, sponsor of this event. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm making these remarks from traditional, unsurrendered, and unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, which continues to be home to Indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land for millennia. This webinar picks up on some of the key issues discussed at the G78's annual policy conference of 2022, the theme of which was transforming international finance toward economic, social, and planetary justice. The report of this conference is on our website, along with videos of all of the presentations. Of particular interest, perhaps, to our audience may be the presentation by Richard Kozel-Wright of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development on Towards a New Bretton Woods, which interrogates the need for and possibilities of reforming the global financial architecture. Today's webinar also follows three in a series co-organized by Climate Legacy and the Group of 78, focused on financing the transition to a zero-carbon economy. In April, we hosted a webinar on the transition in the energy sector and a webinar on greening the financial system. In May, we hosted a webinar on financing the climate transition in the poorest countries. Today's subject, the inequities of the global financial system, came up in this last webinar I mentioned, climate transition in the poorest countries. The transition in developing countries to a zero net carbon, climate safe economy is proving to be a serious challenge on a number of levels. In addition to the insufficient volume of climate financing, whether for mitigation, adaptation, or loss and damage, there is also the issue of the terms on which much of the financing is being provided. Notably, a considerable proportion of financing is in the form of loans rather than grants. This is problematic, particularly for the poorest developing countries that are in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. It is as though developing countries are able to tackle the climate crisis only to exacerbate their debt crisis. I'd like to add that the debt crisis in the global south is not a new issue. Indeed, according to the World Bank, there have been 4 waves of global debt in the past 5 decades. The first wave, which spanned the 1970s and 1980s, was particularly severe in Latin America and the Caribbean and in sub-Saharan Africa. It took 2 decades of protracted negotiations and $114 billion in debt relief to resolve that particular wave of debt. The second wave emerged in the 1990s, and the third during the early 2000s, culminating in the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, with the United States and Europe at its epicenter. The latest wave of debt emerged after 2010. This debt wave is widespread and includes 80% of the global south. In the words of the UN Secretary General, the international financial architecture is short-sighted, crisis-prone, and bears no relation to the economic reality of the day. Its consequences are particularly severe for countries of the global south. So we are delighted to host a distinguished speaker to help unpackage the inequities and instability of the system. Dr. Fred Olaile is a public policy leader, professor, and economist with expertise in trade policy, innovation, political economy, and inclusive development. He's published and shared best practices in these areas in scholarly and popular sources globally. He holds a PhD in economics from Lancaster University in the United Kingdom and an MA in economics from the University of Victoria in Canada. He is director at the Sprott Center for African Research and Business at Carleton University. Dr. Olaile also serves on various nonprofit boards and supports many social causes. Among others, he is president, Economic Innovation Institute for Africa, and member of the Academic Advisory Board, Emerging Markets Institute at Cornell University. Fred, it's a great pleasure and an honor to host you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very kindly, Roy. Thanks for the introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And I couldn't agree more with your introductory comment. Very well said, indeed. Clearly, the global financial system is outdated in its current form and somewhat counterintuitive when you consider today's economic reality. We are talking about 4 major crises at the same time. Many countries are still reeling from the pains inflicted by the pandemic. And then the Ukraine-Russia crisis, which of course led to the current energy crisis and rising inflation, aggressive monetary policy tightening after years of low interest rates. So both policy failures and policy inaction have contributed to unfair economic designs that have perpetuated an unfair and highly distorted global economic system. And interestingly, some would say that we didn't really learn anything from the global financial crisis of 2008. Maybe not. Personally, I think we did learn some things. I mean, thanks to the strengthening of banking oversight in the aftermath of the Great Recession of 2008-2009, after which banks were recapitalized and stress tested to build resilience and minimize adverse impacts in the future. So while it was rather unfortunate that Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank in the United States were early casualties, of the current crisis, we should at least acknowledge that the reforms and lessons from the global financial crisis have been helpful. The 2023 Financing for Sustainable Development report shows that 52 low-income and middle-income countries are either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. We are talking about over 40% of the world's poorest population. So how then do you explain that these countries are borrowing at 14%, with over 20% of revenue going towards debt servicing? And if you look at it in terms of revenue as a share of GDP, they borrow only half as much as developed countries in the global north. But these countries in the global south spend 3 times more on interest repayments. In sub-Saharan Africa, more than half of countries, are in a situation where debt servicing eats up more than a quarter of all government revenue. It is even more precarious in some countries like Nigeria, where every single dollar earned, in the form of retained revenue is channeled towards debt servicing obligations. So that's clearly not sustainable the current debt overhang, higher cost of capital, and limited access to liquidity may erase years of development gains. And if that were to happen, it would be highly unfortunate. It will be catastrophic. I mean, progress on the SDGs and climate adaptation will stop. We just cannot allow that to happen. The international development community has got work to do. So with that background, let me set some context. And let's see if I can share this slide quickly to provide some background with regards to how the unfair economic system, needs some major overhaul. Can you see that slide there? Okay, so I hope you can see that slide. This clearly paints a picture of a situation where in the last several decades, there hasn't been a single major overhaul of our flawed global financial system. At the end of the economic boom that heralded the end of World War II in 1945, leading up to the suspension of dollar convertibility into gold in 1971, and the collapse of the Bretton Woods systems in 1976, the following resource shocks spiraled into the debt crisis in much of Latin America and Africa in the 1980s. The inability of the second, third, and fourth development decades of the United Nations to produce the desired results is a major reason actors in the multilateral system need urgent and bold action. A weak multilateral system and the absence of a fair debt workout mechanism involving both debtor and creditor countries have led to a disproportionate impact on countries in the global south, with huge social and economic costs. So at the core of this is the need to really get financing to vulnerable and structurally weak countries in dire need. And of course, this is about cooperation between the global north and the global south. And we cannot overemphasize the importance of such cooperation in order to ensure that these countries stay afloat in the current environment. And more importantly, so they can build resilience to withstand future shocks. With that background, I really don't want to spend too much time on context and diagnostics. Instead, I will examine some of the proposed solutions from different quarters in the last couple of years. Some of them systemic, while others are incremental in nature. And to emphasize the importance of systemic overhaul, let me talk quickly about the lost decade of development in Latin America and Africa due to the debt crisis of the 1980s, and how some development scholars still argue to date that a more coherent and coordinated multilateral policy regime could have saved the situation. While this may be highly contentious, some wonder if the outcomes in much of Latin America and Africa would have been different compared to countries with similar structures in Asia. So just to put this into perspective, Africa and Latin America were administered doses of the Washington Consensus through structural adjustments. While the development paths in many Asian countries were dominated by export-led industrialization and other paradigms, that produce what we today call the Asian tigers, and even much of the economic ascension in China. So when you look at the divergence between these regions in terms of development outcomes, you will agree that getting policy right at this critical juncture in history is very fundamental. As already seen with climate and other international summits and meetings and convenings, global commitment can wane very quickly under geopolitical tensions and macroeconomic volatility. So while the incremental approach is okay, I dare to say that bold and systemic reforms should not be shunned. And of course, there are many prescriptions for a more just and international financial paradigm. But no matter how you look at these things, there are some common features. And I'll share another slide quickly to look at 4 pillars that I think in many ways sort of summarize, the key dimension of any dimensions of any paradigm that can really help to move the needle. The first here is urgent restoration of fiscal space to the most indebted countries with decimated buffers and ongoing difficulties in meeting their external debt servicing obligations. That's an incremental and urgent type solution. And then you talk about innovative and sustainable resource mobilization strategies. With shrinking domestic revenues and increasing development financing needs, outpacing bilateral and multilateral financing, many countries during the pandemic sourced financing from capital markets at a premium. And without commensurate returns from such investments, you can only imagine how debt servicing capacity will be crushed.
Fred, I think we've skipped a slide.
So you can still see the innovative financing slide, right?
No, you've gone to the next one.
Oh, no, okay. Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. I wanted to speak to the slide on innovative financing.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry, I intervened.
Yeah, that's okay. So you can see the 4 key tenets, right?
Right.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, so in essence, the issues at the heart of debt vulnerabilities are really about low domestic resource mobilization, rising commercial debt, and limited success in translating debt into inclusive growth, structural transformation, and fiscal sustainability. And that, of course, is not something you can fix in the short term. And developing countries themselves have a major role to play. And that's the point I wanted to make about this book. It was released last year. It was an edited volume, by myself and another colleague. And the central idea here is countries in the global south need to also look inwards and find ways to create innovative financing mechanisms. The current environment, when you think about issues like strategic and critical minerals, sovereign wealth funds, tapping into the blue economy as a development finance opportunity. Take the small island country, Seychelles as an example. That was the first country to launch sovereign blue bond in 2018, in addition to negotiating a debt swap deal with the Paris Club in 2015 in exchange for commitment to additional marine conservation and climate adaptation efforts. This is a classic example of how innovative financing, can unlock critical resources. And again, these issues are covered in this edited volume. Now, I would like to also talk about convenings. I want to talk about convenings and all of the global summits, from COP, to G20, to the Bridgetown Initiative, to Davos. While these responses by advanced and developing countries, as well as global responses by multilateral bodies and the international development community must be commended, I personally think that perhaps it is about time to really level set and evaluate the impact of this summit. Can we think about these things in the context of necessary and sufficient conditions? If certain fundamental conditions are not met in a particular country in the global south, maybe these meetings can be repurposed from multilateral to bilateral summits to first agree on some of those necessary conditions, and then use that as a basis to engage on bilateral basis. But to be fair, though, I think we've started to see some good progress in this regard. Take the loss and damage fund proposal, in the aftermath of COP27, for example. So that's not to say that we are not making progress, but I do think that when it comes to structural and institutional issues, apart from the World Bank and IMF, I think it's important for other stakeholders to look at bilateral issues and agree on the necessary conditions. I'll move quickly to the last item on my list, which is the global economic architecture itself. What do we say about the global public policy architecture? And I cannot overemphasize how important this is. The global digital economy is undergoing rapid changes. The fourth industrial revolution has led to structural changes that make it very difficult for traditional economic models to effectively explain trends and patterns. We saw that during the global financial crisis in 2008. The logic of economic science means it is the cornerstone of public policy, but you cannot redesign our flawed global economic system and make it fairer and more equitable without deploying mainstream economics. And Roy, you are an economist, so you can allude to what I'm saying here, particularly when you take it to the gold standard assumption of rationality. So for me, it's like a chicken and egg situation. And under the new digital economy, where disruptions and innovations have become the new normal, then the current models, tools, techniques, paradigms, and approaches to economic policy analysis need to be re-examined. And the global north, global south dynamic in particular. Let me show you this quick slide, to corroborate this, in the African context. So last year I published my book on policy innovation, in Africa, the political economy, of public-private partnerships, with emphasis on policy innovation. And the central thesis in the work is really the increasingly complex nature of society under digitization and the tightly interconnected global economy, and how that would suggest that traditional policy frameworks, devices, and analytical approaches are limited, under the current environment. In the early 1990s, Ghanaian political economist George Aite coined the phrase African solutions to African problems. And what he meant then was to really use that paradigm to reject imported and often contradictory foreign models in tackling many of the challenges on the continent. And this proposition has informed much of the debate on the political economy of development in Africa over the years. So the point here is that because most public policy challenges are complex and non-linear in nature, I think that for countries in the global south, for too long, development assistance, international financial participation are all based on this whole traditional neoclassical economics paradigms that do not really take cognizance of the peculiarities of countries in the global south. Yeah, so with that being said, I think let's now move on to solutions quickly. And of course, there have been many suggestions and solutions in terms of what do we do? Where do we go from here? But I do think that while the list is not exhaustive, I really would like to look at 5. There are 5 themes that, based on my work and engagements globally, in the US, Canada, Europe, and much of Africa. These are 5 issues that I think will be very important in making sense of the next steps and what we should do, what the global community should do from here. And the first on my list really is the whole notion about superstar firms. Neoliberal economic thinking puts a lot of trust in the ability of competitive markets to deliver efficient outcomes in the form of lower prices and a wider choice spectrum. However, the rise of superstar firms has produced oligopolies in the private sector, and this often defeats the purpose of a market-based system. So the shift in economic activity from small and often labor-intensive businesses to large capital-intensive ones should be examined. And to fully make sense of this, we need to realize that the shift is often not within a typical firm, but a steady reallocation in favor of big capital-intensive enterprises. And this process has given rise to the so-called superstar firms with market power in key sectors of the economy, and their increasing tendency of dominating many sectors. And I'm talking about firms like Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and so on. So all of this over concentration of capacity, have major implications. The next item is the global minimum tax. And this is in some way related to the rise of superstar firms. You find that the increased global cooperation aimed at reversing a race to the bottom on global corporate tax rates in recent times could ensure a more effective revenue mobilization model, that can ensure that multinationals stop using tax havens to, dodge paying their fair share of income to both home and host governments. At the February 2021 United Nations High-Level Panel on International Financial Accountability, Transparency, and Integrity, aimed at reforming, redesigning, and revitalizing the global financial architecture to foster financial integrity for sustainable development. A global minimum tax, is one of the 14 recommendations that came out. And it happens to be the most comprehensive overhaul of cross-border tax rules in a generation. About 140 countries agreed to, top up their tax, to give a total of about 15% on multinationals. So this can really help to move the needle. The OECD analysis on this says, about $220 billion in additional income could be generated globally. And the interesting part is that it's a two-track reform. The first track will allocate about 25% of profits from the largest multinationals. And I should also say that while there may be a lack of consensus in terms of the beneficial impact, because some countries in the global south are hesitant, they fear that they could lose out. But I dare to say that another analysis by the OECD shows that both low and middle income countries would gain from the reallocation of taxing rights. The next issue to touch on is illicit financial flows. The United Nations estimates that Africa loses as much as $50 billion through illicit financial flows and leakages to developed countries. And such outflows constitute a major drag on mobilization of resources to really finance development priorities. So again, greater cooperation by the G8 countries for transparency is very important, since these countries are a major destination for such flows. Anyways, and the last item is industrial policy. Industrial policy is another very important issue in this environment. Disruptions in global supply chains and capital flows are really exacerbating things due to deteriorating trade balances and shortages of foreign exchange reserves for external financing needs, including international debt servicing obligations. And when it comes to strategic industrial policy, as you can see on this slide, it's the case that countries really need to rethink what that means. I mean, the global scramble for critical minerals and the use of strategic industrial policy. In the global north, a lot of those things are reshaping the global economic order through billions of dollars in subsidies. And these things are already disrupting international trade and capital flows. Think about the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. And I like this chart, on the growth strategy trilemma by former head of the IMF, their global health and pandemic response task force, Richie, who headed that task force. And the central argument by this framework is that countries everywhere need to rethink their strategic industrial policy. Inflationary pressures and the higher cost of capital are really hampering the ability of emerging markets and developing economies to finance the SDGs and invest in long-term resilience. And indeed, the flawed global economic environment and model means that it is very difficult to trust the free market. And you can think about what that means in the context of innovation capabilities. Innovation capabilities and the global scramble for critical and strategic minerals, national security concerns around issues like semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, energy, and food security. And the other thing to touch on before I bring this to a close is international summits, global summits. Again, they are very important, but it will be very key again to reassess their impact. So we've got to transform the governance of international financial institutions and make them more relevant, more representative, and more equitable and inclusive. And this would mean rethinking current models and practices to ensure that we can really mobilize funds and private sector investment in the ongoing green transformation and digital revolution. I guess I'll leave it at that and open this for comments and clarifications.
Thank you so much, Fred. Those were very visionary remarks and have given us a lot to think about. Before I open the floor to the audience for comments and questions, I have a couple of my own, if I may. There's been a lot of discussion recently about using the SDRs that have been created over the pandemic years, $650 billion worth of SDRs. And many of them are not being used. They were allocated to the richer countries. So the proposal is that at least $100 billion worth of these SDRs could be reallocated to the low-income countries to help them face the challenges of debt and climate change to which you've so comprehensively alluded. Do you have any comments on this particular idea? Because it's swirling around the think tanks and the international financial organizations, and it would be good to hear your perspective.
Thanks, Roy. My response to that will be very quick and short. That's to some extent becoming a little controversial, the whole SDR paradigm. I mean, since that notion came up, during the G20 meeting in 2021, no single vulnerable country has received any of the recycled SDR. And when you look at the potential for the SDR to provide liquidity to help support many of these structurally weak and vulnerable countries that are really struggling to finance their development priorities, then you would agree that many of the issues around multilateralism and the need for countries to come to terms with the reality that the current paradigm is not sustainable, that it has to be fixed. Again, the issue of SDR underscores the whole reason we are even having this discussion in the first instance. So it remains to be seen if progress will be made, but as of right now, based on the work I do in the whole global development arena, I do think that many of those pledges haven't come to fruition, but with many of the global meetings, coming up in the coming months, let's see how much progress we make on that. So that'll be my response to that first question.
Okay, thank you. As you and many of our audience must know, just a week from today, there's going to be a summit convened in Paris on a new global financial pact. And the genesis of this particular summit, it's important to point out, is not only from the French government and President Macron in particular, but also from the so-called Bridgetown initiative launched by the Barbadian Prime Minister Mia Mottley last year. And this is now morphed into Bridgetown Initiative 2, which really is, spans so many of the issues that you have referred to in your presentation. It's about providing emergency liquidity. It's about expanding multilateral lending to governments. It's about activating private sector savings for climate mitigation and fund reconstitution after climate disasters. And it's about a collective call to action. So the summit that's going to take place a week from today in Paris is really hosted not only by the French, but has a lot of developing countries under the leadership of Mia Mottley, the Barbadian Prime Minister. So what kind of hopes or expectations do you have about this? I think a really important gathering that's going to take place a week from now.
Yeah, rightly so. That's an important meeting. I have been doing some work, actually, following trends and what that might mean for making progress, for moving the needle. And before I respond to the meeting itself, I like that you touched on the Bridgetown Initiative. Yeah, I'll speak to that first. Yeah, I mean, that whole thing happened last year, of course, when the high-level summit happened in Bridgetown, in Barbados, and I dare to say that we've already seen some major gains from the initial convening. I mean, at the end of COP27 last year, a loss and damage fund was proposed, as I alluded to earlier in the presentation. And I think the modalities for that will be finalized during COP28 later this year. To the Bridgetown initiative itself, there are 5 components, of course. The first is to provide window for repayment when disasters happen. And that will in many ways ensure that countries do not become engulfed in debt, like what happened during COVID. The second provision is around multilateral development banks, the need for them to mobilize additional $1 trillion to help countries in the global south to fight the climate crisis, particularly to develop resilience. There's also the third part about Global Climate Mitigation Trust, which I think will leverage about $5 trillion from the private sector. And 500 billion in the SDR that we talked about will be a part of that. And other initiatives. But then recently, there's also what you call Bridgetown 2.0 during the convening by the United Nations Secretary General at the 2023 Financing for Development Forum. So as part of that, there were innovations and incremental revisions to the initial Bridgetown Forum. And I dare to say that at the end of this last forum, even the SDG stimulus was launched by the UN Secretary General. So in all, Bridgetown 2.0 is proposing new funding to address excessive risk that are associated with borrowing by developing countries to fund their green investments. And as part of that, you already see that about 100 billion will be rechanneled. There are provisions for debt restructuring with long-term low interest rates, and so on and so forth. To your question on the meeting convened by the French president, that is fantastic. As much as I'm of the opinion that, it's important to really access these meetings and focus more on bilateral meetings to first see if necessary conditions are met, I do think that given what we are seeing, in terms of the poly crisis, I mean, 4 major crises within a span of 2 years, I think it's a right call. And I think that the emphasis that this will really be about increasing financial solidarity, with the global south, that for me is very profound. And even many of the issues that I talked about, in the last hour in my presentation, many of those things are on the table. It's about a new financing pact to build a new North-South contract on climate change, to reform the multilateral development banks, to find new ways to tackle the debt crisis, innovative financing and resource mobilization, which is the central thesis of my book that I just talked about. I think the summit will also focus on international taxes. The whole global minimum tax paradigm is going to attract special attention, as well as the SDR that you alluded to. So in terms of charting a new course for the global financial architecture, I do think that the summit, is a major one to be on the lookout for, and I really can't wait to see what comes afterwards.
Great, thank you. There aren't any questions in the Q&A queue, so let's continue to keep our conversation going. One thing that I wonder about is, where is the money? Where's the money that's on the table? As you've known, the effort to come up with $100 billion worth of climate financing every year has failed, and it's failed most recently, fell short by $20 billion or so. And this is an effort that's been going on for about 10 years. And post-pandemic, a lot of countries, including Canada, have pared back their official development assistance. And a lot of the funding that countries in the global south need is not lending, because that's just going to exacerbate their debt situation and their debt resolution prospects. They need grant funding. They don't need funding that has a debt trail to it. So where is this funding going to come from? You talk about a global tax, but isn't the remedy much closer to home? Don't the rich countries in particular need to think about ways of mobilizing more in the way of official development assistance on grant terms to the countries who need it most?
Excellent question. And I do think that even before the pandemic, before the COVID-19 pandemic, and before all of the other crises, that followed, the issue of winning official development assistance, had been on the table for a while. The development literature, if I'm not mistaken, there were some papers that already alluded to that. And then COVID struck, and everybody pivoted to attend to domestic priorities. So to your question, I do think that in many ways, this underscores the need to look at the entire resource mobilization value chain. And like I showed in my analysis, when it even comes to industrial policy, when it comes to prioritizing national development plans, while there are two approaches, the incremental solutions that we talked about and the overhaul for specific countries in the global south, I can't think of a better time than now to decompose resource mobilization and then pick it one after the other to see what can be done differently. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. Look at new and emerging sectors. The digital revolution is reshaping industries and creating new and emerging sectors. The so-called high fintech economy, the high fin economy, you hear about fintech, prop tech, agri-tech, and so on and so forth. Many countries are taking advantage of the digital revolution to, provide the necessary support and create significant and viable economic opportunity and activity. Second is public-private partnerships. A lot of the debate about looking for ways to turn resource mobilization around. For too long, the private sector dimension, hasn't really been much of a focus for specific countries. Of course, when they do go to the World Bank or IMF, the issues about conditionalities come up and you're asked to, implement some reforms, increase private sector participation. But even without the Bretton Woods folks, can countries in the global south take an inward perspective, increase public-private partnerships, and also look for ways to move the needle? I talk about other sectors like tourism. There are many countries with huge touristic potentials, in the global south. And if only they can look inwards to find ways to increase economic output. How about even issues around education, say technical versus academic education? Can you imagine what would happen if technical and vocational education in many countries in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, if technical and vocational education is reimagined? There are many infrastructure projects and other development enhancing opportunities that if only the capacity needed to contribute optimally, that could change the resource mobilization landscape. And the last item that I should talk about quickly is even the whole idea about rainy day funds, the so-called sovereign wealth funds. I mean, the debate often thinks about rainy day funds as a backup, when crises and other shocks happen. And in the last 2 years, I keep wondering, many countries in the global south have robust sovereign wealth funds and other paradigms that ordinarily should be leveraged to address the situation. Look at the case of Ghana in West Africa. For many years, Ghana had been the success story for development and governance in Africa. And to think that in spite of the fact that they developed a sovereign wealth fund, look how things have really turned around this past year. Nigeria, of course, has its own sovereign wealth fund, and I know that body seems to be contributory, during the pandemic. But in the grand scheme of things, how then do we explain the fact that Nigeria currently spends every single dollar that it earns in government revenue to service debt? So long and short is, it is important, I think, to create a dichotomy in the sense of, yes, international reforms by global players, by countries in the global north, can help to bridge the gap and provide opportunities for a more equitable system where structurally weak and vulnerable countries can have the opportunity to tap into resources to address crises when they happen. Talk about the loss and damage fund. The fundamental thing about that fund is, hey, when crises happen, countries don't have to go bankrupt. There should be a way to give them the space to tap into those resources and address shocks. But my point is, beyond all of those global mechanisms and arrangements and cooperation on individual basis, can countries look at the entire value chains in their countries and then devise a way to free up fiscal space so they can get the resources and the financing that they need to take care of education, healthcare, and other development priorities? And I think it's fair to also revisit the issue of the blue economy, like the ocean sector for countries that have huge marine resources in Africa. There's a lot of untapped potential. And oftentimes we like to look at these issues from a terrestrial perspective. It's okay to look at biodiversity and terrestrial issues, but for too long, coastal countries and other countries that have huge marine assets can really, tap into this to make a difference. I did talk about Seychelles. Again, the first blue bond in 2018 happened, and that has become like a global exemplar in terms of how marine preservation efforts can also help to mobilize the necessary resources to move the needle. So I can go on and on. Look at the digital and venture capital economy, the innovation economy. You look at hubs like Nairobi in Kenya. You look at Lagos in Nigeria. You look at countries in North Africa, Morocco, Egypt. There's a lot of economic activity in terms of the venture capital economy. And companies there are raising billions in dollars. As of 9-10 years ago, you know, maybe there was we didn't have any unicorns, you know, in Africa. Right now, if I'm not mistaken, you have about 6 or 7, if not 8 unicorns. These are companies that have raised capital and have, you know, created value, and they are being valued at over $1 billion. So in summary, my point here is when we talk about resource mobilization in the global south, I think given the crisis these past 2 years, it's very important to create that dichotomy between possibilities, reforms on national basis. Policymakers have got to really look inwards, put all the cards on the table, and figure out what works and what doesn't. In my analysis, I emphasized the need for even a new economic policy architecture. I said for too long, I mean, in economics, you talk about policy analysis, you want to advise policymakers, it all boils down to economic logic and economic paradigms. But the reality is the digital economy is upon us. Models, practices, approaches that worked 40, 50 years ago, even 30 years ago, they are not going to work in the current environment. Let me give you this last example. Economic rebasing in Africa, you know, about 10, 20 years ago, led to massive transformations. By the time countries like Nigeria and I think Kenya, by the time they finished rebasing their economies, what did they find out? They suddenly realized that sectors in telecoms, in communications, in financial services, for many years had been undervalued. And by the time they overhauled the whole system, the economy of Nigeria jumped overnight. And before you knew it, Nigeria overtook South Africa, you know. And ever since, those sectors, you know, what you call the creatives, Nollywood, you know, telecommunications, they've continued to power the economy. The same for Kenya. So the point there is, if policymakers and other pragmatic actors did not take the initiative to look inwards and reform those sectors and look at even, you know, the codes and all of the overlaps, it would have been different to shed some light and give people the attention and opportunity to look at the possibilities. All of the emphasis would have been on the IMF or the World Bank. So in closing, I cannot overemphasize the need for that dichotomy between what is possible in a multilateral sense versus looking inwards, taking stock of what's possible in a country, and then use that to devise new ways, supported by sound analysis and even alternative paradigms. This speaks to capacity, policy capacity, you know, getting state-of-the-art mechanisms and economic management paradigms and approaches that can help to move the needle.
Thank you for that response. When you were speaking, I was thinking that looking inwards and mobilizing domestic resources and taking advantage of supply chains also has a history. If we look to East Asia, countries of the Pacific Rim, including China, which have basically looked inwards and built their own economic growth dynamic from domestic resources rather than the outward bound and outward dependent kinds of models, the paradigms that you've been so rightly criticizing. So there is not only a theoretical cogency in what you're arguing for, but there's also a historical body of knowledge and examples that we can look at and say that this has actually been tried and it's actually worked very successfully in countries that have broken world records in terms of economic growth rates. So
absolutely, and my other book that I talked about, the policy innovation book, I think I do have a whole chapter on that thesis, the whole China miracle. How did they succeed in moving 600 million people, out of poverty in 3 decades? I mean, that's a case study, and I think you couldn't have said it better. So nothing to add to that.
Okay, we've got one question, and maybe we can close on this one. And it's about what happens to, or because of multilateral or other kinds of debt initiatives if you provide debt relief. So the question goes as follows: considering the multilateral debt initiative launched by the IMF in 2006, how would you rate its work in addressing debt challenges among member countries in the global south? Additionally, in light of these changing global economic dynamics, what reforms or improvements could be needed to ensure the initiative's effective integrated contribution? And I would extend that by saying, if there were some significant debt relief provided to the current, group of countries, 40 or 50 of them that you mentioned, how would that kind of relief translate into growth opportunities and amelioration of their economic prospects going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess the first answer to that is, before the global financial crisis of 2008, there hadn't really been any major overhaul or reforms, in the global financial architecture. Yeah, I mean, the debt crisis of the 1980s happened Latin America, Africa, but for the most part, many of the solutions were really incremental in nature, and they were not all-encompassing, if I may use that language. But to the question from the audience, about these whole multilateral initiatives and all of the other solutions that have been put on the table, I guess the question to ask is, what happens to many of the paradigms, like the G20 Common Framework, like the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, like the SDR that we just talked about? One key fact is missing, and that's the fact that many of these initiatives are often thought about not in a comprehensive and holistic manner. I did talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. So take a country like Nigeria. Nigeria is spending every single dollar in its retained revenue to service debt. So in many ways, if you want to really help such a country to move the needle and create a sustainable development financing paradigm, it means it just can't be about pockets of initiatives here and there. No. And if we haven't learned anything in the last 3 years, for me, the most important lesson in the last 3 years is that when countries are decimated, when they are struggling to stay alive, you don't bring solutions that will provide short-term palliatives only for them to then come back to pay back in heavier terms. That's not going to work. That's not sustainable. And that's why I couldn't really agree more with the propositions by the Prime Minister of Barbados on the need to take cognizance, of the fact that when shocks happen, when disasters happen, when crises happen, the first thing and the logical thing and the moral thing, the just and conscionable thing to do is to find a way for countries to tap into resources that can help them to at least return to their pre-crisis path without having to disproportionately spend their resources, to pay back. So in essence, mobilizing resources, private sector investment, and all of that, the multilateral banks are doing their bit, but the polycrisis of rising interest rates, energy crisis, reeling from the pandemic, and tightening financial conditions, all of these have taught us that to address these issues is not enough to create pockets of initiatives here and there that do not speak to the fundamental issues that are, that are limiting the ability of these countries to finance their priorities. We have to salute the multilaterals for some of these initiatives. However, moving forward from this crisis, it's very key to take cognizance of the specificities and create sustainable financing solutions that not only allow them to return to their pre-crisis level, but to also face the scary part that many of these countries are very, very vulnerable to climate consequences in a disproportionate fashion. Many of these countries emit a very tiny proportion of global emissions, but when it comes to the disastrous consequences, they pay heavily, not only through lives and properties and the destruction of their biodiversity, but even in terms of the financial consequences, which then would eat up other resources that are needed to put kids in school, paid for healthcare. It's a web of issues, but to move the needle, to do things better, I do think that the incremental approaches must be disentangled from the systemic overhauls. They should be disentangled, and when countries want to look for solutions, they should be able to figure out which of those two paradigms can help. Do you need quick and urgent solutions to address certain shocks? Okay, but if it's about a systemic issue, then it better be that. It better be about a systemic issue that needs medium-term solutions of 5 to 10 years, and you track and evaluate.
Okay, that's an excellent point on which to end. Thank you very much, Fred, for your inspiration and for your visionary approach to what sometimes might come across as seemingly intractable challenges and problems, but you've articulately pointed out there are alternatives to the ways we've approached issues of crises of various kinds, the polycrisis, as you put it, ones that will bear significant benefits for those countries who seem like are in a desperate position today. But there are ways that have been tested in other places, and we should empower and help empower countries and their people to do things in ways that work for them and suit their people in their circumstances best. So with that, I'd like to wind up this session. Thank you again, Fred, for spending this hour with us. Thank you to our audience for listening. This entire session will be available in recorded form if you'd like to view it again or suggest it to others. Our next webinar is going to be held very shortly on the 20th of June with Tom Ferguson of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, which is what we need today. And he's going to be talking about anti-inflation policy, green finance, and the climate crisis. How are these different strands tied together? Well, join us on June the 20th at 1 o'clock, and you will find out. And thank you finally to Mo for helping to organize this session. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Have a good one.
Thank you.